This podcast does not provide medical advice. Please listen to the complete disclosure at the end of the recording.
Hello, and welcome to Everyone Dies, the podcast. I'm Marianne Matzo.
And I'm Charlie Navarrete.
So, do you have a beverage of choice? Go get it. Put us on pause. Okay, now you can listen. Get your dessert and put your feet up, assuming that you're somewhere where you can put your feet up. And thank you for spending about the next hour with us. Our topic today is about grief and mourning. And later in our third half, Charlie's going to talk about scammers who take advantage of dying people or their families. So, Charlie, what are we cooking today?
Cooking? Nothing. Because I can't really get out too much because, New York City is pretty much not completely quarantined, but, it's not essential for me to go and buy chocolate. Still,
I think that's an essential function, and
well,
I believe that your Governor Cuomo did say that if you're going to get something for death by chocolate, it is an essential activity.
Yes, I'll shoot him an email. I'm sure he'll agree with that. So until he does, there's a grocery store not too far away. So keeping the safe 6 feet away, I am still checking out the chocolate bar situation. So on my recent trip to the grocery store, I decided to focus on Belgium chocolates, different candy bars, some little individual chocolates, and there's just something about, and I'm a big fan of milk chocolate, so there's just something about that texture. It's just not, of course there are chemicals in it, but the ingredients don't taste, for lack of a better word, Americanized. It's just smoother. It just tastes more natural. It's more flavorful. That's what I'm trying to say. So both the candy bars and the little small pieces of chocolate. And so I'm going to keep this research going. And
okay.
Yes, so let's see. So maybe if anyone, there's a wide variety of chocolates in this store. So maybe if anyone can suggest any other chocolates that I can try. I'm looking at Swiss chocolates next. I'm not sure if they have them there. But shoot us an email, and I will, I'll make the sacrifice and go to that grocery store again and try a different type of chocolate.
Charlie, you take your death in your in your hands for us.
Yeah, I hope that's figuratively speaking.
Me too.
So what about you? What do you got?
Well, we put up a recipe for chocolate trifle. Is it trifle or truffle? It's not a truffle.
Wait a minute.
It's a trifle.
Wait a minute. Truffles, I know. What's a trifle?
There's so many things I could say to that.
Be nice. I'm in New York.
Yeah, that's why I am putting my sock down my throat so that I don't say all the things I wanted to. Well, it's like a multi-layered cake with pudding and cream and all kinds of stuff.
Oh.
But I think I'm saying it right, trifle. Because a truffle is something completely different.
Right, yeah.
And it's nothing to trifle with.
No, not at all.
Come on. I laugh at your jokes.
I am laughing with you. But I'm laughing quietly. I don't want to interrupt what you're saying. Yes.
Speaking of jokes, Will Rogers said everything's funny as long as it happens to somebody else, which is also true about death. And sometimes people really make a fuss about black humor that nurses have or the things that we can find funny. And I just have to say that's just how it is. So, do you have a joke for us?
Moi?
You're the funny one.
Huh? Actually, yeah, let me, I think I remember this right. Let's find out, shall we? So,
okay.
Okay, and just to make this authentic, it's an old Irish joke. Okay, so let me yes. Let's see here. An Irishman walks into a bar. That's original. So, an Irishman walks into a bar in Dublin, orders 3 pints of Guinness, and sits in the back of the room, drinking a sip out of each one in turn. When he finishes, he comes back to the bar and orders 3 more. The bartender asks him, "You know, a pint goes flat after I draw it. It would taste better if you bought one at a time." The Irishman replies, "Well, you see, I have 2 brothers. One is in America, the other's in Australia, and I'm here in Dublin. When we all left home, we promised that we'd drink this way to remember the days when we drank together." The bartender admits that this is a nice custom and leaves it there. Well, the Irishman becomes a regular in the bar and always drinks the same way. He orders 3 pints, and just drinks them all, one after the other. Mm-hmm. Well, one day he comes in and orders 2 pints. All the other regulars, notice and just they don't know what to say to this. So when he goes back for a second round, the bartender says, "I don't want to intrude on your grief, but I want to offer me condolences on your great loss." And the Irishman, looks at him, doesn't quite understand what he's talking about. And then he just starts to laugh and he goes, "Oh, no, everyone's fine. I've just quit drinking." Oh, yes. And I look forward to everyone's emails about my Irish brogue. Thank you very much.
Well, that's a great segue into our second half, where I'm going to talk a bit about grief and mourning. We're still in the coronavirus, the throes of coronavirus's arms. Yeah, and right. There's, been a lot of deaths related to this virus. And the thing with them is that they're coming fast, and they're, of course, unexpected. And so it seemed like a good time to have a little bit of a chat about grief and mourning. Mm-hmm. And, I'm a teacher, and so I can't help but teach sometimes. So I need to start with some definitions. So if they sound teachy, please forgive me. But I want to make sure that we're using the language, as it's intended. So how would you define grief, Charlie?
Something, the first thought that came to mind is that something was ripped out of my heart. Something ripped out of my soul. There's a missing piece. I know different people experience grief in different ways. But for me, that something is now missing. That that something is missing, and it's possible it will never be replaced. Mm-hmm. And that's okay. You have to, at least in my situation, life goes on, obviously. But I've just heard a lot of times where people say, "Oh, I'll never get over this. I will always, have this big loss, and I'll never get past it." And I've just heard a lot of times people say, "Oh, get over it. You got to get over it. You got to move on, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera." I don't agree with that. I think it's okay to have grief. It can't consume you. It can't control your life. But, years after, for example, someone dies or you've had a great loss, you get back into the rhythm of things, your life moves forward. But if 10 years down the road, a song comes on and you suddenly think of that person and you feel sad or you just miss suddenly you miss that person. Yeah, that's okay. It's okay. It's okay if you still have that grief. Again, it can't consume you, but you don't. I've just seen too many, and I'm saying this wrong. I've just seen where a lot of people live with that grief and still miss, a partner. I mean, it's horrible when it's a child, but sometimes even pets.
Right.
I mean, your life is not fashioned by that, but it's still in you. Your life has moved on. You find other things, but that's there, and it's okay. It's okay to grieve, to have that grief, as long as it doesn't control you. Your life, you have to move forward, but it's okay to have that grief. So when someone says, get over it, no, don't let it control you and consume you. But no, you don't have to get over that grief.
So I think what you did is gave us a definition of grief, mourning, and loss, all wrapped into one. And so...
Yes, and that was my intention from the beginning.
And it was so eloquent. But if you don't mind, what I'd like to do is kind of break it down. And so grief, the definition of grief, and we define these things, scientists define these things, because if you're going to study something, you need to define what it is and have a sort of a universal definition so that then you can study it. So grief refers to the process of experiencing the psychological, behavioral, social, and physical reactions to the perception of a loss. So if everybody knows the coronavirus. I think everybody knows by now that the coronavirus is going around. We topped 200,000 diagnoses today. And if you hear a friend of yours has died from this, so grief would be how you experience it, like psychologically, how you feeling, behaviorally, like how you act. I mean, do you go get drunk? Do you go punch a wall? What do you do? Socially, well, we don't have that option at this juncture in our life, but socially, going to, oh my God, I'm going to come over, and all the family and friends get together, and like, oh my God, I can't believe this is real, kind of thing. That's that social reaction. And the physical reaction, some people throw up, I've seen people have heart attacks when they've had a family member get bad news. Some people are not able to eat. Some people are able to eat too much, whatever that physical reaction of the perception of the loss. So mourning is the coping efforts that are made to accommodate the loss of a loved one. So what do I do? How do I cope with the fact that this person has died? And that process, that mourning process, can really take a long time. And as we're going to talk today, you'll find out, I'm sure not surprisingly, that you're right. It doesn't ever go away. And it shouldn't be expected to go away, because that person, while they've died, you still have them. So...
But, I'm sorry to interrupt, but with that too, it sounds like, somebody needs to have some sort of insight to that, because if someone, if it had a catastrophic effect on someone's psyche, and then that person is surrounded by people, well-intentioned people, but people who maybe have their own, issues or own thoughts or their own inclinations about grief and about mourning, people can just, I imagine, impose their values on the person who has just lost someone. So I don't know. It seems that, the person who's going through the grief and it's difficult at that moment, but also needs some insight. Maybe just some time alone just to process everything, instead of just always being surrounded by people telling them how they should be feeling.
Well, and, and extroverts would say, yeah, I want to be around other people. And introverts might say, yeah, I need some time to myself. So we can't say, here's the one way that it is. You need to go, in the bathroom and close the door and think about what's going on. That doesn't work for everybody. I think what we're doing in terms of offering an educational aspect for people to say, what are the theories, what are the thoughts behind grief and loss, that might also help them say, what, this is personal to me, and that might work for you, but it's not going to work for me, without trying to twist yourself into a pretzel to be what somebody else expects you to be in terms of how you're grieving or how you're mourning. So when we have a loss, we need to readjust and kind of reorient ourselves to the loss. And there's, Rando's an author, talks about that you have to reorient yourself in order for, which is how the mourning occurs. So she has 3 steps, and that steps, and oh my God, please don't even ask about Kubler-Ross and the stages of
well, just when you said steps, I was
grief
about to...
and mourning.
Yes,
no,
okay.
no. And the reason I'm like, no, is because when people see steps of mourning and loss, they expect, well, okay, I'm going to do this first, and then I'm going to do this first, and then I'm going to do this, and you're just going to march along and go through all of those steps. The reality of the situation is you do one step, and then you do another step, then you go back and do that step, and you're kind of doing all of them at the same time. It's like watching the Sybil movie. It just is like it's all happening all at once. And that's because those stages of grief that she talks about are a way to think about things, but it's really not the reality of how we go through grief and mourning.
I think too. I'm sorry, but I think also, to your point, if let's say in the 7 stages, you hit, I don't know, stage number 3, if you're cognizant of it, I mean, it could take you months to get to stage number 4. So, I mean, it's what you're saying. It's just not as simple as ABC.
No, and that's what people sometimes feel frustrated is that, well, I've heard about these stages of grief. Which one am I supposed to be at now? It's like there is no such
exactly.
thing.
Yes. Yeah.
So let's try to think about it another way. So when we try to readjust and reorient to the loss, so that's not saying, oh, you got to do this first and you do the second. What you're doing is saying, this person is no longer in my life. And I wouldn't have chosen this, and nobody would have chosen this, but here's the reality. And I either go to my bed with a bottle of scotch and stay there for the next 40 years, or I figure out what, you want to say something? I can see it on your face. Did it remind you of a movie?
No, I'm sorry. I was about just to comment on the scotch, but I would diverge from your point, which is at this moment when you're explaining this is not a time to talk about scotches. So I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Well, my favorite is Laphroaig. Have you ever had that?
No.
It's Lefroig, I think. It's very woody. Very good. Anyway, as I was saying, we have to readjust and reorient to the fact that person's not in our life. And so it has 3 aspects to it, okay? One is that of course, I mean, it would make sense that there's a central key in this is the deceased loved one, the person who has died. This really, what you do is, in terms of using this model for grief and loss, is that you think about, what did I go through with this person? What are the things about this person that I enjoyed? And what am I going to do now that they're not here? How do I remember them? How do I transform from that old relationship where they were alive and to a new one where they're not? So it's that thing between they were here and now they're not, and I have to get used to them being gone. And how do I do that? And part of that is in like the funeral process, the if you have a casket and you have a wake, or if you just have a really huge party with scotch and death by chocolate products, whatever it is that you're doing, is that moment, that feeling that this person's not here, and I wish they could be, maybe, because they would really think this was fun. Or if they were here, we'd be laughing hysterically because this is so stupid, or whatever it is. But that idea that they're not here, and I have to figure out what's my life going to be like, which takes you to the second step, which is the mourner, the person who has to personally adapt to the lost one, to the loss of that person.
You know what? I'm sorry, but if I could, it's funny you're saying saying this, because I heard just a little clip this morning on the radio that here in New York, where we have the highest number of people with the virus and people who have died from the virus, that there was just a quick clip, and it's funny, they didn't linger on it, but that there were just not enough spaces for and I don't know if it seemed to indicate there were just not enough spaces for a mourner, a family member, a friend, to look at someone who had just died and spend time with them, because space is so limited that bodies. And forgive me, I just heard it very quickly. I didn't have time to listen to everything, but basically that bodies were being removed immediately and put into, I believe it was refrigerated trucks, and there was really just not time for people to actually mourn. So I hear what you're saying.
Or begin that process anyway.
Yeah. So what you had, said, just before about, you get a bottle of scotch, or you just have to go in a room and scream. At least, with most of the time, you have an opportunity to actually start going through that process. But it seems that not only here in New York, but just in other places around the world, sometimes people don't even have that chance to say goodbye.
Well, then you'll be really interested in the next episode of Everyone Dies, where we're going to talk about traumatic grief.
Oh, okay. I should really start reading my emails. Okay, yes, I knew that was coming up. Thank you very much.
But and that's a good point, Charlie, because there's the grief. There's sort of part A and part B. There's there's non-complicated grieving, which is what we're talking about today. And then there's that complicated grieving that comes from trauma. And that's why I wanted to talk about both of those in our podcast, because of what's going on with COVID. But it's hard to talk about that traumatic grief without sort of a baseline for what is the non-traumatic or the non-complicated grieving. So that's what I'm wanting to do now. Got
it. Yeah.
So of the reorientation and readjustment, remember I was saying that there were three aspects. One is the deceased loved one. We talked about that. The second is the mourner, who is that person who's adapting to their loss by revising their world. Because their world is different now, because that person that they were in a relationship or knew, or however you want to say it, has died. And then the third aspect is the external world. That involves us kind of learning how are we going to healthily live in the world. This person who we love is no longer here, and we need, if we choose to still continue and to live our lives, we need to find ways that we're going to reinvest in the world and compensate and adapt to that person being gone. Back, in the 80s, I guess it was, I ran a halfway house for older adults who we had deinstitutionalized from the state mental institution. And they had an average of 52 years in the state hospital, Charlie. And so we built this really cool congregate house. 8 people lived there and had lived there for probably about a year and a half when one of the women died. And she was the most rough and tumble kind of woman that you could ever hope to meet. She was like one of those people that could drive you insane, but you loved her to pieces. And so this was the first time that these people had, been in a situation where they were really living, closely. There were 8 bedrooms and 8 people, and they shared, the kitchen and the dining room and activities. So they were close. And so we called a family meeting, the people who lived there and the staff. And I said, she's gone. Let's call her Sandy. Sandy's gone. And what are we going to do? She's not here. What are we going to do? And one of the women, so we talked about, how should we honor her? Because it was like January in New England, and the ground was frozen. And so they would kind of store people to the spring thaw, and then there would be the funeral, which was a new concept for me. I just never had heard of that. But anyway, that's how they did it. And I said, she's gone now. So what are we going to do? How are we going to honor her? And somebody said, we could go to church. And somebody else said, she wouldn't want to go to church. And I said, what do you think she'd want to do? And she said, she'd want to go to the bar and have a beer. I said, should we go to the bar and have a beer? And they said, yes. So there's, these 8 older adults. Everybody was like over 70. Go out into the van, and we go down to a local bar, and we all order beer, and we talk about Sandy. And I said, now that Sandy's not here, there's things that Sandy did for us and was to us that we don't have anymore. And so in order to keep Sandy's memory close, who's going to take over the job she had for us? And so one woman, oh my gosh, she was just such a lady with this really long white hair that she would braid up, and she just was a lady. And she said, Sandy always liked to blow kisses to the truckers when we were out in the van. I said, uh-huh. And she said, I'll do that. I said, okay, so we have that part covered. What else did Sandy do that we want to remember? So what that is integrating that person who's died into your life to say, this is something they did, and I still want that in my life. And so I'm going to do it. They're not here to do it. I'm going to do it. And that's a good way when you've had somebody who's died, is to take a look and say, what is it that I so admired about them or so appreciated about them that I'm going to start doing sort of in their honor and to keep that with me? Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. And to play, I don't know why I keep going back to this, because I'm thinking, like devil's advocate. What if someone is not ready to do that?
Well, I'm not saying, the minute you hang up the phone after you hear that they've died, figure out how you're going to integrate them. The point is to say that they used to be a living presence in your life. Mm-hmm. They no longer are, but there are ways that you can keep them close, that you can remember them, that you can do something that you used to do. And so when you get to the point to say, I've heard that it helps you feel better if you bring something of that person into your life. You know what I'm going to do? They used to knit the most beautiful baby blankets. I'm going to learn how to knit, and when I do that, that's to honor my friend.
Right. Okay.
So it's not immediate. It's all of this is a process over years. So it's a good question. Is that there's no pressure to get through stages 1 through 4 in the first 48 hours. That's why these aren't stages. These are sort of things that have to happen in order to readjust to that loss or adjust to that loss. So there are processes of mourning. There are things that occur naturally within the mourning process. And one is to recognize the loss, acknowledge it, understand it. In the time of COVID, I don't know that this is really how we're going to look at it and think about it, that it's going to be more of the traumatic loss. But let's leave COVID out of it and say, I need to realize that this person is dead. And again, that's part of what the funeral does, is that you can see the body. You can physically see, yes, this has happened. It doesn't seem real or feel real if you don't see that person is actually dead. Reacting to the separation means that you let yourself feel the pain. Accept that these feelings, the hole in your heart, as you described it, are part of that process, as part of mourning, and that you don't go through the mourning process without some emotional reaction. The next aspect of it, another thing to think about, is think about and re-experience that relationship that you had with the person who died. Review and remember them realistically. It's always so interesting to me when it doesn't seem to matter who died, if it was somebody, in the community or somebody in our own family, is that we develop amnesia about a lot of stuff.
Oh, so true. Yes.
So when I'm talking about remembering and reviewing realistically, is like, did that really happen that way? Or am I, misremembering because I don't want to dwell on the fact that,
Oh, that's interesting.
Whatever the bad thing is.
Okay, because when you said that, my thought was how people just, skim over. Suddenly, someone was a saint. They're, absolutely wonderful. They almost walked on water. When in reality, no, they would really get on your nerve. They were always cantankerous or often cantankerous, but all that seems to be forgotten because you never want to speak ill of the dead. They're not here now. You always want to paint a rosy picture. And no, there are just times you just want to pinch someone. And that doesn't go away because they've died, but you would just never say that. now that they're dead. And, and at that moment.
It's not necessarily, right, socially accepted to do that. But I think, Charlie, we're saying the same thing, is that we put them up on a pedestal if they kind of deserve, quote unquote, to be there or not. Look at the attachments that you've had with the person who's died and how they attached into your world, and realize that they are going to need to be unattached. Like if, for example, if every Wednesday night you went with your friend Sally to karaoke, and Wednesday night rolls around, what do you do? Do you go to karaoke without Sally? Do you and that's what this phase is about, is like, okay, they're not here. What am I going to do now? Maybe I join a book club on Wednesday night, or maybe I keep going to karaoke. But those are kind of decisions you have to make because they're not here. Another aspect is to readjust and realize that you're going to go into this new world that doesn't include that person. But you do that without forgetting that old world that did include that person. So you're readjusting to this landscape where the person who had been there with you for whatever isn't there. Make a new world while still remembering the old one. So really what you do
sure. Yeah.
is
you're not
developing...
right. Yeah.
Developing a new relationship with the deceased person. Adopt new ways of being in the world. Form a new identity. Like if you've always been Robert's wife, and now Robert's not around anymore, you have a new identity. You're now Robert's widow, and that's different. So that's what I'm talking about when you have to figure out how to move in a new world and still remember the old world. The last aspect of that is closure. And it's probably really the wrong term to use. But maybe the better word is accommodation. There's never closure. Sometimes I think we could live forever, which we won't because everyone dies, and not have closure with people where things are just hunky-dory and right the way they need to be. So when somebody dies, you have to accommodate to the fact that they're not there. Grief, we can resolve the grief. That grief is that reaction. But mourning never resolves. You'll miss that person forever. There will be a smell or a song or a moment, God knows how long down the line, where you'll react. My sister and I used to always go to the Hallmark store the day after Christmas to get half-price wrapping paper for next year, if that gives you any insight into how we live. and it was years later that I went into the Hallmark store, and that smell and that feel of those those Midwest little Hallmark stores, not the big ones they have now. And I just burst into tears. And I thought, it's been so long. And I'm sobbing. My dad always chewed juicy fruit gum, which you rarely smell anymore. But if I smell juicy fruit gum, I think immediately of my father. Do you have examples like that?
Actually, as soon as you said juicy fruit, and you said you never smell it anymore, I was thinking that at that moment, just then, you never smell it anymore.
I know, it's a great smell.
Yeah, it is. It is. I know I have experienced that, and I can't quite think of.
Well, if it comes to
It
you,
was, yeah. It
jump
was.
in.
It had something.
Is it coming? It's coming.
You know
It's
what?
coming. It's almost there, Charlie.
It had something to do with food. And I don't remember now. So, okay, so now that I've wasted all this time, no, it doesn't come to mind right now. I have experienced that though. Yes.
Okay, with food.
It's like some sensory thing, memory.
I'm sure I'll get a text in the middle of the night and say, it was this.
Yes.
So
Yes.
Worden, who's a psychology professor at Harvard, talks about the tasks of mourning. And his tasks, not steps, tasks, are to accept the reality of the loss. You know, how many times you say, oh my God, I can't believe this. I can't believe this. This person's, has died. But accept the reality of the loss and to work through and be present through the pain of grief. Grief is painful. And unless, like I said, unless you're going to go to bed for the rest of your life with a bottle of scotch, you've got to grieve. And you either grieve now and start the grieving process now, or there are people who kind of shove it down and say, I don't have time for this right now. I'll deal with this another day, but it ain't going to be now. And I worked at a college in New Hampshire, and there was this guy whose mother had died, and he had that kind of reaction, was, I don't have time for this right now. I got this and this going on. Okay, fine. And we were master teacher scholars, so we would evaluate other faculty. So we went to listen to a lecture, and the lecture that the faculty was presenting that we had to evaluate happened to be on grief. And I just watched his face as he just crumpled, because it'd been all this time, it'd been, oh God, probably a year since his mom had died, and he just was pushing it down, not dealing, not even acknowledging that loss. That's the thing. It's not acknowledging that loss. Yeah, she died, and moving on, and not doing the pain of the grief. And he just cried through that lecture, and that was good. He needed to begin that process, because your body only has so much energy to push that down and not pay attention to it. And at some point, the gates are going to open, and they're going to open. You can't not grieve. You will at some point. And rather than let it get to the point of being traumatic, what Worden talks about is that work through that pain of grief. The third aspect that he talks about is adjusting to the environment in which the deceased is missing. You know, this is the world that they were in, and now they're not. And how do I adjust, and what do I do, and going through that grief. And then to emotionally relocate the deceased and move on with life. You know, as to say, here's where this person is, this is who they were. And I don't mean move on, like people say, move on, get over it. No, I'm not talking about that. But to realize that life is still there, and that life is a gift, and that you do not honor the person who died by not continuing to live.
Hello, and welcome to our third half. In our third half, we have some of our funeral theater, where we put the fun in funeral. We have a report from our roving reporter, Buzzkill Charlie. But first, we have the pleasure of having Nancy Miller with us, who is the hospice chaplain at Encompass Hospice in Oklahoma City. Welcome, Nancy.
Hi, thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We've been talking about grief and loss and bereavement, and we thought, what a better person to join us, but somebody who helps people process grief, loss, and bereavement. But really, before we talk about that, I've known you for probably 15, 20 years now, and first met you when you were running the Brain Tumor Foundation in Oklahoma City. And I remember meeting with you in your office and seeing a baby blanket sitting on one of the chairs. And you told me about your son, Cade. And I think our listeners might be interested in hearing about Cade. And if I remember correctly, would he be like 21 now?
Yes. Yeah. He would be 21 now. Yeah. Well, my son, Cade, was born with a brain tumor. He was born in 1998, and about 6 weeks after he was born, I noticed that he had some, he just didn't seem to be developing quite on target. And so I took him to the doctor, and thank God we had a PCP that, a pediatrician that recognized that there was some stuff going on with his eyes and checked his optic nerve and saw some pressure there. And so immediately sent us for a CAT scan, and they found out that he had hydrocephalus. And that was caused by brain tumor that was on his brainstem. And so he went through his first 2 surgeries, brain surgeries, and then they couldn't really do anything with the tumor because it was so small because of where it was located. So they relieved the pressure on his brain from the hydrocephalus, which gave us a good 9 months of good quality life with him. And then right before his first birthday, he had some additional changes in his eyesight and some other things. The way that he was, because he was beginning to walk, and just some things that I noticed, took him back in, and he had the tumor had tripled in size and had spread down his spine. And so it was at that point that we went back in for another surgery, and then we started chemotherapy. So he was 1 year old when we started chemo, and there really wasn't much they could do to help him. And so we went everywhere. We went to the National Cancer Institute in Maryland, and we tried everything that we could, and it was too aggressive, and he was too young. The preferred treatment for brain cancer was radiation therapy, and they would have had to have done a whole brain radiation on him, which would have destroyed any quality of life that he would have had at all, if he was able to survive it. And so we opted not to do that and to focus on giving him good quality life while he was with us. And so we had him for about an additional 2 months, and then he passed on February 17th of 2000. Yeah.
It's so sad and so out of sync with what we as mothers should be doing, right? We shouldn't have to ever bury our children, right? They're supposed to do that for us. And so it throws life really off and out of kilter. How did you get through that? Or are you still getting through that?
Well, yeah, I'm still getting through that. I don't think you ever, you never get over it when you lose somebody that you love and somebody that's close to you. But especially, I think a child is especially difficult. And so I still have my moments even today, that when an anniversary comes around or something, anything can happen sometimes that'll just trigger that grief. Now I'm able to respond differently now because I've had, 20 years But, initially the way I responded was I just threw myself right into trying to help other people that were going through the same thing. So because we were going through that with him, that there was just not a lot of support for brain tumor families. And so I started the first support group for brain tumor patients in the state of Oklahoma back in 2000. So my son passed on February 17th of 2000. And then I held my first support group meeting in April of 2000. So literally 2 months later.
Wow.
And then I know, then I did my first advocacy event in July. And I made I had this vision of this big brain float rolling down the middle of Bricktown for 4th of July. And so I built a huge brain float, and we had everybody that was coming to the support group came along, and we just did started doing some advocacy stuff. And then that just kind of developed and continued to snowball. And I began to mentor families that were going through the same thing, because you just, you don't know what you don't know. And so that's how I dealt with it, was I really just threw myself into helping other people that were going through the same thing. At the same time, grieving and dealing with the divorce. Ended up going through a divorce about 1.5 years later. My oldest son, Rain, was 7 at the time. And so, also dealing with him. He's lost his little brother. Now his mom and dad have separated and divorced. And there was all kinds of grief and trauma that was going on during that time period. And I just, some things I didn't handle so well. I made a lot of mistakes. I did a lot of things I'm not really proud of during that time period, because I just probably wasn't, I was doing everything I could to not deal with it, not think about it, but eventually, all of that, God has just really used everything that I went through with my son when he was sick. And since then, all of the experiences with the mistakes that I made, and even the good stuff that I did, like I started the Oklahoma Brain Tumor Foundation, which was a wonderful thing that helped, hundreds of families over the years. And gosh, I think we ended up donating about $1.5 million to families to help with bills and all kinds of stuff like that. Yeah. So we did a lot of really good work. So there was a lot of good responses, and some things that I did really wrong, but you're feeling your way through it, and you're doing the best that you can. And but the thing that I think the thing that's beautiful about it is that even the mistakes I made, God has been able to use those, and I'm able to now continue to speak and minister to families and people who are grieving, that are going through the same thing. And it's nice to know you're not alone.
Right.
So, yeah.
So is there 1 or 2 or 3 or, things that you can remember from that period, Nancy, that you would say to yourself, this is the thing that really helped me get through the death of my child? Are there things that you can tell the listeners that when you're looking back, you say, this really helped?
There's, I think that there are things that help, that we're often kind of surprised by, which are usually the small things, that people do, that you least expect. to one thing that, and it seems, and it was really small, but it just really touched my heart and made a difference for me, was not too long after my son passed, the social worker at Children's Hospital sent me this book by Gerald Sitzer. It's called Grace Disguised. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's a wonderful book where he talks about that he lost, 3 or 4 family members in a drunk driving accident.
Oh my God.
And so he talked, yeah, and they were in the car, but he loses his wife, his mom, and I think 2 of his children. Yeah. And he writes this book, and the book is really about his relationship with God and the feelings and the emotions, and how he kind of came to terms with a loving God that allows bad things to happen. And I think that was the biggest challenge for me, because I am a very, very strong person in my faith. And I've always had a very close relationship with God, but I was really challenged in my faith. That was where I feel like I was struggling the most, because I was so angry at God for, I had prayed and prayed and prayed that he was going to heal my son. And then he took him home. And so that book helped put into words for me a lot of feelings that I had that I couldn't explain, a lot of things that were going on with me that I couldn't put into words to be able to communicate to somebody. And so over the years, I have kept a stash of those books on me. And so when I have a friend or somebody that I send them a copy of that book. So that was a wonderful book. And it was very touching and kind that she sent that to me and shared that with me, and just out of the blue. And I thought that was very nice. And that I think being able to, the most important thing I feel like with grief is that you are able to have somebody there who tells you that it's okay and allows you to grieve. And to be where you are in that place, because we have a tendency, especially with people, with friends and family members who don't understand, they've not ever had a loss like that before, and people respond differently. And they kind of expect us to be in certain places at certain times, or to manage things in a certain way. And to have somebody there to say, you're not wrong, you're not doing it wrong, there's not a right way to do it. And allow yourself to be where you are. And everybody else can just kind of, they just have to, deal with it, right? Because you have to feel those emotions, you have to work through them, and sometimes we have to sit in them for a little while. But I say, sit in it for a little while, but don't allow yourself to lay down in it, because when it turns to, clinical depression, then we're not managing it well. Then we've got to make some change. We got to do something different, but so I think having somebody there that is able to just acknowledge and affirm that you're okay, and that you're going to be okay, even though you don't feel okay right now, is probably the most important thing. It's the reason I really focus on doing a lot of grief groups, and a lot of that's really where my ministry has gone, is into grief. And so I do a lot of grief counseling, and I do a lot of grief groups at church, and then also, being a hospice chaplain, and being able to look back and see how, even in those times when I was so angry at God, that first of all, he's big enough to handle our questions. He's big enough to handle our anger. He's big enough to handle all of it, and that's okay. And so seeing how he's taken every bit of all of that, and now it's the beauty for ashes concept that you see in Scripture, is everything that is meant to kill and, destroy us, and God uses it and he turns it for good. And he really can bring beauty out of that, but it's a process and it takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. And so that's I think the thing that has helped me the most is just being allowed to grieve and having somebody that can kind of help me keep my eyes open and focused forward. It also helped that I had a son that was my 7-year-old was the thing that kept me going through that, because I knew I had to get up every day and take care of him. So I think that helped too. I credit him a lot with saving me.
Right. I can see that.
Yeah.
Well, that's an incredible story and heartbreaking on lots of different levels. And I'm with you in that grief as a mother and imagining going through that type of loss.
Another a thing that I end up talking about a lot, especially with with my people that I'm counseling, is, and I have a friend who ended up losing a son this year, not too long ago, and what I think is what you just said makes me think of is that people say stuff to us, in our grief, that you're just like, that's really stupid. That's like the stupidest thing you could say to somebody, right? Because they don't know. And it's like I always tell them, I said, thank God. You have to show them some grace because they don't know. And thank God they don't know, because I don't want them to know. I don't want them to understand, because that would mean that they were there. The only way you could understand is having been there and gone through it. And thank God, they don't have any clue about, really how to relate to you and what to say, and that always is really kind of eye-opening for people. It really speaks to exactly what you just said, is that, it's the things that we take for granted, and you're like, but thank God they're there to take for granted,
Right.
Thank God, he's there that I can get, or she's there that I can get angry with her, and then it just puts a whole different perspective on things, doesn't it?
Right. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Because you can't hold on to it, because you're right. If she wasn't here, I couldn't get mad at her.
Right. Right. And then you'd be looking for that opportunity, wishing that you had it. Yeah. I think about that a lot with my older son, and it's really colored a lot of my whole kind of how I parent now, I think. And it's interesting because, I'm remarried now, and my new husband, didn't walk through that. And so, it's always, and you can't understand, why you parent the way you parent now, because he hadn't had to go through what I've been through.
I really appreciate you being willing to talk with us about this. Nancy is
Absolutely
going to do some regular sections with us on different topics. And if you have questions for Nancy that you would like her to discuss, you can send them to mail, MAIL, at everyonedies.org. That's EVERY, the number 1, dies.org. And we'll continue to do some interviews with Nancy and answer your questions too.
So as we're talking about grief, there's a scene from Old Yeller where the boy has had to shoot Yeller because he has rabies, and his dad has come back, and the dad wants to talk with him about his grief. And so Charlie and I are going to act, in quotes, act out this scene. And we are wanting you to focus more on the words and the advice and how the dad approaches this and not our abilities or inabilities. And if you go to the webpage, there's the reference to Old Yeller. And if you've never seen it, I think it'd be great if you saw it. Don't you, Charlie?
Yeah, and actually, I was a kid when I saw it, maybe on TV. But yeah, it's been, decades since I've seen this.
Yeah. But I can remember seeing it, and I think I saw it in the movie theater, and crying at the end because it was just so sad. And now I've told you how it ends, so you'll be warned. But yeah, it's a good Disney film.
Yeah.
So this is imagine a pasture, and the boy has just buried his dog. And action.
Your mama told me about the dog. Come sit down, son. And that was rough, son. As rough a thing as I ever heard tell of. But I'm mighty proud of how my boy stood up to it. Couldn't ask no more of a grown man. Thing to do now is try and forget it. Go on being a man.
How, Pa? How are you going to forget something like that?
Well, I guess I don't quite mean that. Reckon it's not a thing you can forget. Maybe not even a thing you want to forget. What I'm trying to say is life's like that sometimes.
Like what?
Well, now and then, for no good reason a man can figure out, life will just haul off and knock him flat. Slam him again the ground so hard it seems like all his insides is busted. But it's not like at all that. A lot of it's mighty fine. And you can't afford to waste a good part fretting about the bad. That makes it all bad. You understand what I'm trying to get at?
Yes, sir. It's just that...
Yeah, sure, I know. Saying it's one thing and feeling it's another. But I'll tell you a trick that's sometimes a big help. You start looking around for something good to take place of the bad. As a general rule, you can find it. Brought you that horse, I promise.
Yes, sir.
I reckon you ain't in no shape to take pleasure in 'em yet.
No, sir.
Well, we'll just keep 'em a while. Maybe you'll come up to feel different later on. Your mama was fixing supper when I left the house. Might hurt her feelings if we're not there on time to eat it.
So, and that came out in 1957, right?
Yes. Do you remember when in 1957?
Well, I would have been about 9 months, but I think that it was Christmas.
Yeah. No, you must remember exactly. You were 9 months. You could have processed this.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying.
I remember the Wizard
really
of Oz
young.
too, but you know what? I wasn't there when it was premiered.
But don't
yes,
you wish
it was,
you were?
In a small way, yes. Yes, it was actually on Christmas Day. Mm-hmm. Yeah, 1957, yes.
So I think the dad gives some pretty good advice. And,
what's that?
Well, he talks about just what we've been talking about, is that you need to, that you're not going to ever really get over that loss, but you'll learn to live with it. So, they say that time heals all wounds, but it really doesn't. There's no
but
magic.
they also say time wounds all heals, but I guess that's for another discussion.
Yes. So there's really no magic in, any point along the way. It's like, oh, they've been dead a year, or they've been dead 2 years. There's no magic point where we say, oh, there's been a loss, you're over it by, you should be over it by now.
Right.
Death doesn't end a relationship. The relationship that we have with the person or the animal or whoever that's died, that relationship is always there. But what we need to do to be healthy is emotionally relocate the dead person to a different place within our lives. And, commemoration, funerals, rituals, all of those things really help the process of finding out and figuring out what's this new world without this person in it. We want to be purposeful and have sort of a meaningful change, because grief is really pretty profound as we go through all of the challenges of grieving. And also to support other people through those tasks. Help them to find a desire to live and to thrive and to have a life without that person.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts on that?
No, it's just it's just what you said. Like in Old Yeller. I know it's a movie, but it I think it does apply in real life. Someone dies, or maybe a pet, and how do you get over it? Well, you don't, but you move on.
You get through it.
You get through it. There you are.
There you are. We have a new feature today called The Vultures Are Circling. This is hosted by our roving reporter, Buzzkill Charlie. This segment tells stories or answers questions about people who take advantage of sick, dying, or grieving people. So, Buzzkill, we have a question from a listener. You ready?
Oh.
The question is...
We will find out, yes.
The question is, my dad recently died. I know scammers target widows. What scam should I tell my mom to watch out for during this tough time? Buzzkill?
Oh, yeah. Of course, at that moment, people are vulnerable. Men and women are vulnerable. And so much is done now through, through social media. Yeah, I mean, people find out information through social media. And what I mean is, after a certain amount of time, people may turn to social media, just, it'll be on Facebook or wherever. And so people know about this. But also, a lot of people start to join different like online dating sites.
Do people really do that?
Not moi, but yeah, it's I'm old-fashioned that way. It's pretty popular because so you have your group of friends, but also obituaries are online. You can find them online, from different newspapers or local newspapers, and there are people who will just go online to try to find out who has recently died and who is a recent widow or widower.
Jeez, that is so low.
Yeah. And people will look online and find an obituary, take notes. If there was some interest an interest that the deceased had, for example, maybe would collect stamps, would make a note about that. Just pick up little, pieces of personal information. And a lot of times, of course, because it is the internet, there is a lot of information about us online. So if you type in, a widow's or a widower's name, you can find out, let's say the widow she's not interested in stamps, but maybe she likes to travel. Or there's some little blurb in some local newspaper that the person likes taking cruises. I wouldn't recommend it right now, but travel cruises. So the scammer will make a little note about that. Just some little piece of information. Maybe there's something about some little hobby or interest, and someone will make a note about that. So when the scammer tries to connect with someone, say through Facebook or some online thing, they will, just as a conversation gets going, they will mention something like, for example, you know what? My favorite candies at Easter are Peeps. You know those little Peeps, and the widow or widower will say, "Oh my God, that's my favorite candy. That's so weird." Well, no, because the scammer did his or her research and knows just how to plant those little seeds, and just to start to build interest, to try to make that connection. And especially at that moment, because the widow or widower is that vulnerable. And at some point on online dating, or maybe they connect on Facebook, eventually as we've been saying, you were saying, Marianne, people need to move on. Suddenly, oh wow, look, this person has this interest in Peeps. When he was a kid, he was and Peeps, yeah, just the candies.
Do you ever put a Peep in the microwave?
I have not had that experience.
Easter's coming. Easter's coming.
Well, we'll see. It's Easter and coming. It's almost like the second coming, but that's for another time. Okay, so I'm afraid to ask. So once you put a Peep in the oven, in a microwave, what happens?
Well, they get really soft and gooey like a s'more, but better.
Yeah. Oh, see, I was looking for an explosion here. Okay. Oh, so they just like melt away.
No, I'm talking about a mouth explosion.
Yeah, I'm going to leave that one alone too. So getting back to this, I mean, all this information has been picked up. Somebody's in a vulnerable position, and wow, suddenly here's someone who shares the same interests, who knows about, they share similarities. And of course, eventually there may be a phone conversation. If you're in the same area, maybe you go out to dinner, and, things start to roll along like a relationship. But please remember, the person is still vulnerable. So what many times what these scammers do, once they, get themselves into the other person's life and just make that connection, then suddenly something happens. Maybe there's we're supposed to get together and talk on the phone, and then, there's no phone call.
But doesn't that only happen after they get your money or something, right?
Well, yeah, but how do they get that money? You can't just suddenly, I mean, with a lot of these guys or women, they don't just suddenly ask for money, but usually they will, make the connection, allow that to blossom, and then suddenly there's some crisis. There's some family emergency. Kid, their child supposedly, needs some sudden operation, or is stuck somewhere in Africa and doesn't have the money to get back, and I just don't know what I'm going to do. And then out of the goodness of the widow's or widower's heart, it's like, oh, well, how much is that ticket? Or the person will already say, it's like $5,000 to fly from, Zimbabwe to California, and just plants that seed in the person's ear, in a person's mind, and the person will, like, buy that ticket, or the money will be sent for that ticket, and then that money's gone. There is no ticket. There is no daughter. There is just a way to get into someone's wallet.
So answer to this girl's question, I assume it's a girl, is that, I guess pay attention to your presence on the internet and be suspicious of new people coming into your life?
I would say the top thing, before and just in general, be careful of the presence you create on the internet, and basically the paper trail, if you will. If you have one conversation or you appear on some site and you love petunias, and maybe in some totally unrelated site, a small magazine article, a small local newspaper article that mentions something about stamp collecting. People go online and just find all this information, and they can then use that to take advantage of someone in a very vulnerable position. And if they are still that vulnerable, and sometimes not even just about vulnerability. I mean, people want to trust each other. And if you just trust that, hey, somebody I know, someone I care about is in trouble, most people want to help. But you have to, and again, as we said in previous episodes, you have to protect yourself. You have to advocate for yourself and ask questions and just find out.
That's great. Well, thanks, Buzzkill.
Oh, you're very welcome. And for everyone, if you have any questions regarding scams or death, any questions for us, death-related jokes or anything else, just death-related, please contact us at info@everyonedies.org. That's info@everyone, the number one, dies.org. And thank you for listening. Please stay tuned for future episodes of Everyone Dies. Our thanks to our CEO, retired Major General David, our producer Sandy, John, our technical advisor, and our friends and family who are helping make this podcast a reality. This is Charlie Navarrete.
I'm Marianne Matzo.
And we look forward to talking with you soon.
Bye.
Bye.
This podcast does not provide medical advice. All discussion on this podcast, such as treatments, dosages, outcomes, charts, patient profiles, advice, messages, and any other discussion are for informational purposes only and are not a substitute for professional medical advice or treatment. Always seek the advice of your primary care practitioner or other qualified health providers with any questions that you may have regarding your health. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard from this podcast. If you think you may have a medical emergency, call your doctor or 911 immediately. Everyone Dies does not recommend or endorse any specific tests, practitioners, products, procedures, opinions, or other information that may be mentioned in this podcast. Reliance on any information provided in this podcast by persons appearing on this podcast at the invitation of Everyone Dies or by other members is solely at your own risk.